Welcome to the Talking with the School of Transportation podcast with your hosts, Ian Campbell and Harnek and Ian. Let's get into it now. Welcome to the Talking with the School of Transportation podcast presented by Centennial College. I'm Ian Campbell, and as always, I'm here with Harnek Gill.
Hey, Ian. Today we are also joined by Jason D'Amico and Robert Lirette.
Repeat offenders.
Yeah.
So
this is the first time.
Yeah.
Oh,
First time
you didn't
together.
listen to my podcast? All right, I'm still going to teach you the ropes. No, I didn't. Not at all.
What? Get out.
Yeah. I did make my students
we
listen.
need downloads.
I made the students listen.
They're my students too.
Yeah, I know, but I attached 10% of their grade to it.
Perfect. Great. Well then.
So
Maybe
today
we're
we
not
were
presented by Centennial College anymore.
yeah, that might have to change.
Yeah, the first two repeat guests.
All right.
All right.
So you guys
do we
should
get a
feel-
hat or
We
a
either
shirt?
did something
or-
I
really
gave you a lot of
wrong or
stickers.
really right.
I've
Yeah,
given
we'll
a
give
lot
you
of
some more
stickers.
stickers.
All right, perfect.
Yeah. And today we're going to be talking about some basic SSB 1 stuff, I think.
Yeah,
Right.
that works
Yeah,
for
we're
me.
going to
Yeah.
get after suspension types.
Yeah, I think
right?
just like the basics, SLA type 1, SLA type 2, MacPherson, multi-link. What does that look like? And we have two of the SSB teachers here with Harnek and Jay. Well, Jay's taught everything, but
Yeah, I know, but they've had me in SSB for consistently for a
time.
little bit now, yeah.
yeah.
So you're getting the hang of it.
Somewhat. There's a lot of parts, man. I'm not
There
going
is
to
a lot
lie.
of parts.
Yeah.
And Rob,
An upper
Rob
and
I have
lower
taught
controller?
SSB here and there throughout, so we'll
Yeah, a couple times here and there.
we'll try and chime in as much as we can.
Not a subject matter expert.
No, but who really is these days?
But you are supposed to be.
That's what they say.
That's what you say.
In the mirror every day.
When I give myself my pep talks. You can do this, big guy. It's just a car.
So, what do you think is probably the most difficult part of suspension systems that a level 1 student might come across?
Well, I got an easy answer for that one, but let's see what you guys say.
Well, actually, I want to hear your easy answer.
Do you?
Yeah.
Always taking the easy route, eh? So I'm going to say that the hardest part for them is actually identifying that the suspensions are different.
Okay.
And to a layman underneath, you've got a bunch of arms, some springs, a damper, and some joints. It's the arrangement of them, the connection points. They always have such difficulty, seeing through those components for what the arrangement actually is. Like a traditional control arm, like an A-arm. You're very familiar with that A-arm shape, right?
But they don't know how
the
it
wishbone
connects to everything
Yeah.
else and what makes it.
But even
Yeah.
just that arm, like there's one pivot for the knuckle, and then there's two mounting points to the frame.
Yep.
And that's your A-arm, right? You take that A-arm away and you go for single bushing mounts. So now you need to have like two longitudinal arms,
Mhm.
and they just don't see the relationship that it's actually serving the same function, even though cosmetically it's entirely different.
See, this is why I like to hear you talk about it, because we teach pretty much the same thing, and we're the same content for SSB 1 or 2 or 3, whatever it may be. And I do find that it's a lot of the same sort of issues we run into and trouble we have. One thing I do is I've moved away from the term like A-arm or double wishbone or wishbone, and I focus on calling it single pivot, double pivot, just to make it a little bit simpler. And I find that is a term that's used in the textbooks and stuff as well. But I noticed the exact same thing. I just had students today in my level 2 class refer to struts on a Jeep Wrangler.
Yeah.
And I said, well, hold on a second.
Coilover shocks type of thing?
It doesn't even have coilover shocks, right?
Straight up shocks.
It's just straight up shocks. I'm like,
Yeah.
well, hold on a second. Testing a strut is way different than testing just a dampener, right? Or
Yeah.
something with a solid axle front and rear. But I guess we should break down then what suspension types are going to use what components. And I guess firstly, what are our suspension types?
Yeah. Well, before I even get into the types with my guys, like we use the term control arm, right? And I don't care if it's a single mount or double mount A style, just the term control arm. I like to get solid definitions out of the way. So I'll draw the center line of the vehicle, and then I'll draw just any arm. And I'll say, look at this arm, visualize geometrically what's going on with the suspension. How does it control wheel position? Does it stop the wheel assembly from coming closer or further to the geometric line, so moving perpendicular to it? Or does it stop it from moving parallel? And once I can get them to visualize that, then I start attaching names, because manufacturers are notorious for interchanging names for the same part, right? So I'll be like,
that's why I wanted to have you and Harnek on together, because you say some terms that Harnek doesn't use, and I think Rob can attest to that too. Like, we use different terminology for everything, right?
There's so much terminology in everything that we deal with.
And that's one thing I think we always kind of preface our lessons with is, hey, manufacturers are going to call this something different.
Yeah.
And that's why it's important to do what you do there. And I do the same thing, is define what makes it a control arm.
Yeah, like my weed out my definition for them, regardless of what the manufacturer calls it. I'm going to call it a control arm if it prevents the wheel from moving perpendicular to the geometric center line, closer or further. Control arm is my name. If it prevents the wheel from moving parallel, if it's in the front of the suspension and it goes from suspension forward, we're going to call that a strut rod. If it goes from suspension rearward in the front, we're going to call that a radius rod.
Nice.
If it does the same job for parallel position control in the rear, we call it a trail arm. And then those are my three terms for basically the same part.
Okay, pause for a second, because that was really well said. But when we say perpendicular and longitudinal movement, can you just kind of break that down a little bit more? Because I think people listening may be like, or maybe Harnek, you want to try and relay what he just said, or Rob? You know what I mean? Like, the wheel, based on the way the wheel moves in proportion to the vehicle, right?
In relation to the geometric center line. So you take the frame of your vehicle, that longitudinal line, take the width of the frame, divide it by 2. It's the mathematical center line of the car. And we talk about that
hold
frames,
on.
right?
I'm going to make that simpler. So it's a line down the middle of the car.
Yes.
Front to
There
back.
we go.
License plate.
Okay.
Well, in lab, I'll actually, after I explain it, correctly, and then I get a little looser with my terms, I'll actually have a car 6 feet in the air. I take the crayon, the tire crayon, I go from license plate to license plate right under the car and just draw a
That's
chalk
what keeps
line.
happening to
That's
the
me,
crayons.
man. That is me.
Who's
Obviously-
got crayons under the car?
Yeah, I'll draw that line literally, and then I'll say, look at the angle of the suspension components. If I took that away, this wheel, and when I say it moves parallel, the wheel assembly parallel to the geometric center line, it's forward or backward in the wheel well if it was viewed from the side, right? And if it's preventing it from moving closer or further to the geometric center line, that's the tire coming underneath the car to the center or away from the body. So I try to, it's all the same angle. I'll try like several different terms.
Almost like tilt. It's like tilt versus setback, essentially, right? Like, if you're getting the bigger terms, trying to visualize that through speak.
For the most part, I usually tend to stay with everything as being parallel movement or perpendicular,
Yeah.
right? Because that's 90 degrees or that's 180 in line. And then I find, even when I show them, I make the quick drawings. So I'll draw the center line of a vehicle, and at all 4 corners, I'll draw one of each of those parts with arrows in the direction that it controls movement. So then, at least I've got the term control arm down. That way, it doesn't matter if it's an A shape or it's a single mount, it's still preventing that wheel from moving in that direction. We're going to call that a control arm. What the manufacturer calls it, I don't care.
Yeah.
Because then how do we test? How do we communicate if there's 15 names for the same part?
Learn them all.
Yeah.
What if they're all different?
Well, and then some of them contradict each other,
That's
too, right?
Drivetrains. I noticed that first time I taught level 2 drivetrains. I'm like, this is the case. Oh no, this is the carrier. Oh wait, what is it? Chrysler calls it this.
Yeah.
You call it this.
Yeah.
So I
The manufacturers have freedom to call it really whatever they
100%.
want.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it doesn't help us for communicating.
No,
So it's like,
That's why
I'm just going to give it the one
simply
name.
define it.
Yeah, I just give it the one name. And then after the fact, if a manufacturer wants to call their strut rod, compression rod, attention strut, it doesn't matter. That's just for ordering the part.
Yeah.
So I'm more concerned with, do you understand what this thing does in that location? And this is the one name I'm going to give so we can communicate consistently every time.
Good. I like that a lot.
Yeah, that's a big challenge though. But that could be like a week right there, just getting that basic thing through.
I spend a lot of time on the suspension components and defining them and just kind of hammering it in.
Yeah. And then, you think, you've gotten through with, this is a single bushing control arm, ball joint at the end. It's a straight stick for the most part. And then all you got to do is in the center between connection points, they put like an elliptical arch in that bar. And now suddenly nobody knows what it is again. I'm like, that's why I say it's all smoke and mirrors. Don't look at the middle. Look at the connection points. Never mind the shape in the middle. But it gets them every time.
Yeah.
By the elliptical arch, you mean that the rod's just bent.
Well,
it's like
just
made
for
a certain way. Yes,
for
exactly.
ergonomics, because they want to route something by.
Yeah.
And suddenly, because it's got a funny S-cam profile to it, it's no longer what we were talking about. I'm like, guys, end to end, same connections. Don't be fooled by that.
Yeah, I like saying mounting. Where am I mounted to? What 2 points am I mounted to on either end? And that's what I'm doing with that component, or
I tell them,
defining something
look
based
at
off
connections.
that.
Never mind what's in the middle. Look at the connections. The middle is just all smoke and mirrors. And then I think, even like to exaggerate, I'll grab like a steel A arm, and they'll agree it's a control arm, it's an A style arm, and then I'll put the exact same item down, but it's fabricated out of aluminum. And I'm not getting an answer. I'm like, guys, it's the same thing. Well, no, it's not. It's made from aluminum. Well, no, back to the connection points. Has the identical job. So that's probably the biggest hurdle. Once you can get through that, then we can start seeing, what's a conventional strut.
And I find the way around it, like when they're struggling, is really just like repeat, have them ID these components and suspension types so much. There was a point where I would have the students on lab, if I had all like 5 hoists available to me, I'd have them go through every single car, spend X amount of time on the first one, give them a little bit more time, and then rotate along. And it's one of those things that just practice makes perfect, right? So
the kicker is, though, like, we take that time, but in reality, they're apprentices.
Yeah.
They've been seeing this stuff at the workplace nonstop.
No one's defined it for them, though, right?
Yeah.
So until you've done that, now that's kind of unlocked it for the students.
Yeah, that's probably a little bit of a hook there, right? It's like, guys, even if you're doing oil changes, you see this all the time.
So what's your favorite type of suspension, Rob?
MacPherson strut.
And why is that?
Easiest to change. You need to get out quick struts. I was talking from the shop point of view, right?
Okay, but hold on.
No,
what's a
personal point of view.
MacPherson strut?
MacPherson strut with a coil spring around it as part of it, one unit.
All right. So how's that different than a coilover?
Well, but what if we're talking about the modified MacPherson then? It's still a MacPherson strut, but there's no spring on the strut.
But different location for the spring.
Yeah.
So MacPherson struts where it's not modified, conventional, and I can change it all in one piece.
Now I'm going to do like
Quick
what I do
strut.
with my class, where I don't want to hear this Mr. MacPherson's name again.
Okay.
Because if there's 2 variants of his design, his name is no longer relevant. It just confuses it. So it's conventional.
That's insane.
Conventional strut suspension or modified strut.
And anybody that's
Let's take the MacPherson out of it.
My favorite.
Hey, it worked. Look,
Yeah, perfect.
And
Yeah,
anybody that had Mr. D'Amico currently has PTSD listening.
Yeah.
He's like, why can't I say
See, this
MacPherson?
is probably where we disagree upon that, because conventional, I haven't surveyed every single car out there to see what is the majority to make it conventional. I find that SLA Type 1 I'm seeing almost as much as I see MacPherson strut, right?
Those are the 2 predominant ones.
Predominant. So which one's conventional
Yeah.
then?
Strut
he's
wise,
talking about
Conventional
the
struts.
conventional
Yeah.
was the first design. And then it was later modified. So
Okay.
we get the term conventional. It was like the first and foremost model that you associate.
Yeah.
That's
I
what
don't-
conventional. Not
Yeah.
conventional as in majority of vehicles.
See,
It's
I
the
have no
conventional
problem
strut
using
design.
MacPherson strut because your textbook will use it. Your service information will
Not my
use
textbooks. I cross it out.
it.
Because then what happens, MacPherson just becomes the go-to answer for everything in suspension. It's like, stop. If it doesn't narrow it down, just don't use it.
Yeah.
Right?
All right, so Rob, MacPherson strut, what are some of the other ones? These guys said it, but
Well, I'm an SLA 1 guy. Like, hands down, if like personal suspension, favorite choice, because I heard the word favorite. It's a SLA 1. So
SLA 1?
Rob's choice was probably incorrect. it's actually SLA 1. What's your go-to?
Live axles. Hotchkiss.
Oh,
yeah.
You know what?
I knew that was going to get you excited.
Yeah. As a Jeep owner, no, I'm embarrassed now.
So I don't think we defined what a conventional strut or MacPherson strut is.
But do we even get there? Because I kind of really enjoy just the component talk. Because maybe we save the types for another podcast and we just keep talking about
even that. Even if we take that route,
like what
is a strut? Because I can have an SLA type suspension where the coil is around the shock. So what makes the strut different?
Okay.
Jay?
I'll field that one if you want.
Go ahead.
When I do dampers, shocks versus struts, I always say shocks and struts are exactly the same but completely different. That's a good way to start like an intro, right? They're exactly
and
the same.
Everybody's right on the same page. They're
Yeah.
like, what?
Yeah. Well, I asked them, are the 2 terms interchangeable, like synonymous? Is a shock a strut? Is a strut a shock? And we just have 2 names for the same part. So I'll tell them that they're exactly the same but totally different. From a dampening aspect, internally, they are similar. But the external, is where I'm going to say they differ, right?
One has a sway bar mounted on it.
Well, so the way I usually spread it out for the guys is
I'm kidding.
I'll get away from the actual suspension components and I'll go open a hood and I'll put a metal prop rod up on the hood, right? And I'll say, what's this called? And they'll say hood prop rod, prop rod. Eventually someone says hood strut. So struts locate other components, right? You remove a strut, the alignment or orientation between those components will change. A shock absorber has no effect on the alignment. So you take your solid live axle, which is my favorite suspension, as I previously said.
When static.
Yeah.
When the car's static.
Yeah, I'll have a vehicle at ride height, fully loaded, and I'll say, I'm going to slide under the back of this Jeep right now, and I'm going to unbolt the shocks. What's going to happen to me? And they're like, oh, you're going to get crushed. And I'm like, all right, then watch this because I'm going to do it, right? And you can remove them. There's no change in ride height. There's no change in wheel alignment. There's no change in any orientation. So I'll say effectively, guys, your shock absorber, you can remove it and you can still operate and drive the vehicle. The ride's going to be a little different, but mechanically, geometry-wise, everything's still there.
Yeah, it's like those 90s Chrysler New Yorkers that you hit the brake and it would just bounce for days down the road.
You folks listening in know all about those.
Yeah, the best ones were, the short wheelbase. Well, they'll know Safaris and Astros because they're still around.
Maybe.
They're starting to disappear.
But the workies love them. Like they are really little trucks. And those are the ones where, when the dampers were shot, that was a license plate bender. Like if you hit the brakes with some intent at speed, you could hear that air dam scrape the ground at speed. Like they were the wacky shack when the dampers were gone. But back to the shocks versus struts. That's how I define it, right? Internal, same operation. It's external. Vehicle is not going to miss a set of shocks. Take a strut away, other parts are going to change their position.
Yeah, you know what? I define it in a similar way. I say the strut provides positioning for the knuckle in the wheel. And if you were to cut it in half and it breaks in an accident, what happens to that wheel? It's going to cave in. If I lose a strut assembly, my control arms are still positioning my wheel in place. There's no effect on where that wheel is. So similar.
Yeah.
The shock assembly?
A shock? Yeah, is that what you meant to say? If you lose a shock assembly?
Oh, sorry, coil over. Did I not say coil over?
No.
You said strut
You said
assembly.
Sorry, yeah. If I lose the
that's
coil
a mark
over.
off. That's
Yeah, it's a mark
Confused me.
off.
Now we have no idea what we're talking about.
That's a mark off. Yeah. Well, glad we cleared that up.
Shocks, struts, we kind of talked about control arms. What are other components in a suspension system? Back to level one.
That's the extent of my knowledge.
Ball joints.
Ball joints.
Yeah, well, those
tie
are pivots,
rods.
right? Arms wise, we got our trail
Well,
arms.
I think
yeah, they're all.
frames are part of that a little bit, right?
Sure.
They're the
Yeah.
mounting point.
Yeah, the rest
right?
of the arms really are just control arms at
Tires.
different angles.
Tires would
and they get a
be-
different name.
Tires would be a component of that a little bit.
Well, I like the ball joint thing, right? Like we're getting into because we're going to get into the suspensions and then eventually the types, right? It's like, what is the knuckle using as a pivot?
Sure.
Because their knuckles are going to have upper and lower pivots. Now, are we talking, depending on our suspension type, and that's why we want them to identify the suspension types. You might have an upper ball joint paired with a lower ball joint, an upper strut bearing paired with a lower ball joint, kingpin,
Yeah.
right, with a lower bearing and
That's a good
brass
movie,
bushings
right?
all the way.
Like with
Yeah.
bowling movie, wasn't it?
Yeah,
Kingpin, isn't that a
Woody
bad guy in
Harrelson?
Spider-Man?
Woody Harrelson.
yeah.
It's both of
Isn't
those
that
things.
Spider-Man
Daredevil,
villain?
I think. Daredevil? The
Yeah.
Kingpin or something?
That's the
Spider-Man.
bad
He's
guy.
in both.
Okay.
Both.
Both
yeah.
of them, yeah. He gets around.
What is a Kingpin?
Yeah, it's a bushing, solid bushing, goes through, locating two suspension components, basically our pivot point. Ball
Yeah.
joint. Old
Okay.
style stuff, I want to say.
No, heavy duty stuff.
Heavy duty?
Yeah.
I wouldn't say old style. If you're going to include like
Because it makes Jay feel bad.
no, well, if it, for light duty application, yeah, it is like
Older.
70s, early 80s,
Yeah.
right? But everything you see out there, heavy duty, and there's more
Still.
trucks than cars.
Yep.
They have to be kingpins.
So if we're talking heavy duty, back when I was 16 and I did a co-op placement from high school in a Peterbilt shop, I was the guy that had to hold what they were using to drift through with their sledgehammer,
Which
the
is
kingpins.
usually-
and that was
That's called an apprentice.
Yeah.
yeah, that was the extent of my experience with kingpins.
Yeah.
Hold this
this,
while
not
we
move your
swing
hands.
a
Yeah.
sledgehammer at your head.
And 90% of the time, that drift you're holding is a ground down kingpin from
That's
the
exactly what it was.
previous vehicle, yeah.
Yeah, that's
How do
exactly
you
what it
serve
was.
a
Yeah,
kingpin? Well, you're going to need another
Yeah.
kingpin.
Anything solid I-beam.
Okay.
Solid I-beam, it's going to be kingpins, hands down. There's no other alternative.
And so define it better for us because I couldn't do it.
Kingpin's not that hard. So you've got your solid I-beam, you've got the yoke of your I-beam, and then you've got the yoke of the spindle. Brass bushings pressed in each, and it's like a hinge pin that drives through. So that means our spindle, as far as range of motion, can only articulate in one direction, 30 degrees left, 30 degrees right. That's your steering swing. There's no other articulation. It's a solid axle. So it's pretty much when I teach to the students, I'll literally go open a door. It's a door hinge. That's all it is.
The pin through the door hinge.
Yeah. And for obvious reasons, because if we talk about suspension types and following the load through the components, if you're using a solid I-beam, you've got only one mission in life. It's support weight. You cannot have a weak pair of pivots in there. You can't have a ball and socket joint. It would be
for heavy duty.
Yeah, it would be break. Well, you wouldn't use a solid I-beam on anything that was other than heavy duty. So it's always going to be a kingpin.
Yeah. Like students always say, oh, I had an RV that came in and it had kingpin still. Well, the amount of weight in there is incredible.
Yeah. Well, all your old half tons were kingpins too, right? And then the Ford twin I-beams, even on the light duty stuff, they, depending on the year, make, model, they could go with either a pair of ball joints or a kingpin because it was a lighter duty. And it was a twin I-beam anyway, right?
And those were around 30 years before students were born.
You know what?
No, that's what makes me think like
twin
old
I-beam,
style stuff,
twin
right?
I-beam, it's a Ford only thing. All the big cubies are still rocking them.
Yeah, they actually still have some
it's
application.
a Ford only thing.
It's rare, but yeah. Ford only, like you're saying.
It's only ever been
That's why
Ford.
it's the Ford I-beam.
Yeah, well,
twin
it's like
I-beam.
with all the other suspension types, it's kind of like any manufacturer is free to pick and choose with what they want.
Yeah.
Except when I do teach twin I-beam, I will say only Ford.
Okay, so
and Mazda.
here's a question.
Which
is
is
a
Ford
Ford,
badging, right?
Because my experience with them is so little, the biggest issue I've always found with SSB is how people check them. And you could take it to the shop, to school. What I get is people that lift the car up over their head. They start draining the oil. They grab the tire way up high. They shake it left and right. And then they go, yeah, it's good. Or it's bad if they feel play. And I'm trying to explain to them, whether they're apprentices or students, that you can't check front ends like that, right? You have to check their specifics on ways you need to check certain front ends. Sometimes you need to look up, you need to load a control arm. You need to get the vehicle weight on it if you're checking certain things.
Yeah.
So with kingpins, is there anything specific about checking them?
So kingpin is load carrying, but because of the suspension setup and where the spring is, any method where you get the tire off the ground is fine. There's no special procedure for that.
So lift the car way above over your head.
Yeah.
Well, outside of height-wise, right? So something like that would be like for a kingpin, for your twin I-beam, for your solid live axle, like the front of a Jeep with upper and lower ball joints. What I'll generally tell the students is, because what you're saying, I just put in different terms. I say, look, if you want to check a load-carrying joint, so first you need to identify it's load-carrying. But the way to check every load-carrying joint is to unload the joint. You unload the joint by loading the spring.
Students are going to get really excited with this conversation.
Yeah. So, well, when I put it in those terms, like I say that
I'm loading my joint right now.
Yeah. Well, but that's what I'll say, right? Like, it's like, here's the rule for every vehicle. And this rule is going to be correct. If you want to check a load carrying joint, you must unload it. That's a blanket statement. Now, depending on the suspension type, what method do I need to do to unload that joint? But I get that blanket statement through first. You cannot check a load carrying joint while it's loaded. And simply getting the weight of the vehicle off the tire, you've removed the sprung weight off the joint, but now the spring tension is replacing that. So you need to unload the joint. And once I get that through, like joint's got to be unloaded. Okay, now which suspension type? This is how we unload that spring. Mm-hmm. Right now comes the particulars, but at least you understood the main mission here. So yeah, when you get guys that just get a tire off the ground and start shaking away mindlessly, that method is like, that is the check for like a conventional strut. Just get the wheel off the ground because the lower pivot is non-load carrying. That does not apply to every single vehicle that comes in the shop.
Yeah, but that's how they check them all, right?
Well, and then depends where you work, because majority of your vehicles are what? Unibody, transverse powertrains with like a conventional strut. So from one respect, from the student's point of view, that's how we check every car, because every car that's coming in is really a cookie cutter of the same suspension. But you need to be aware.
That's where it gets interesting too, though. So that is what we teach. And this is why you were saying earlier, we need to ID what suspension we have. If I know I have a MacPherson strut, I have one ball joint, it's non-load carrying, 0 free play allowable. right? So feel anything, it needs to be replaced. But then, and I do this all the time, we have the Dodge Journey in the SSB lab, MacPherson strut, so 0 free play allowable. When you look it up, you find that there's a spec for something like 29 thou of allowable free play. Some manufacturers will allow for some free play in their non-load carrying joints.
Yeah. So what I found with that, because I had one with a GM years ago. So when we teach where the load is, it's like it just goes with the suspension, but you never supersede manufacturer's recommendations, right? So we've got it's a conventional strut, non-load carrying lower ball joint, 0 axial, 0 radial, no perceivable movement. You see it, you feel it, it's scrap. And then a manufacturer, it was GM. I had a G6 come in when they were pretty new, and I did my usual check, and I could see by eye there had to be at least 20 thou. Not that I would have to measure because, hey, it's past 0. I perceived it. So I look up the spec, and sure enough, GM's procedure was support the vehicle by the frame, the torque boxes, let the suspension hang, and then they wanted you to put a jack under the control arm and load it up to the proper operating angle. And I say the word load because that's what you're doing. So this joint had free play that I would have called any day of the week, but they almost wanted me to compress the arm into the joint and recheck. Of course, it was tight. And every oil, I made the customer look, according to what I know, every other vehicle, that's an epic fail. But I did see this bulletin from the manufacturer that says revised test procedure. So every oil change, the vehicle would come back and I would recheck it the traditional way, and it was just getting looser and looser. And when you put a jack under the arm, of course, you consumed up all that radial movement. It was tight. So the customer wanted to change it. And I said if it was my vehicle, I would change it regardless of what I see from the manufacturer. Problem was at the time, the arms were like $900 each. And he didn't want to put in $1,800. So I kept checking every oil change. We waited it out, and I would always make a phone call. And then eventually one day aftermarket had them, and they were like $100. And he said, let's do them. Threw in the aftermarket ones. But of course, what do you think I did when I put in brand new aftermarket? Let me check them.
Yep.
The traditional method, I checked them, 0 free play. So whenever I see something like that, it's like, hey, manufacturer, we can't supersede it, but it goes against everything we kind of know and have experienced, right? That's a tough one. Yeah, that's got you in a spot there, right?
Yeah. And I do exactly the same thing you did. Make a note of it, see what it's supposed to be, and at the end of the day, based off your experience, you do what you feel you're comfortable with, and you let the customer know.
Yeah.
Right? So that's heck. I've seen Cadillac, the one in the SSB lab. The free play spec is 125 thou.
That's huge.
125 thou. It's comical.
Wow.
It's comical, and that's on both their joints, the load carrying and non-load carrying. Yeah, so again, I tell the students the same thing. Sir, what would you do if you saw it at 100 thou? I'd tell the customer
and
we probably want
procedures
to
for
replace.
checking that?
Yeah.
Like, what is the procedure for checking that one?
The procedure is, I don't know it off the top of my head. I'd have to look it up.
Okay.
Yeah, but it is similar. They want it loaded.
Yeah, they want something, or unloading a joint, right?
Yeah.
Again, it's always back to, I always found them lifting the car overhead and shaking it. And even if it
that's
is your
one method for all vehicles.
Even if it is your conventional strut, I try and tell them, like, you're doing it over your head. Like, you're not even really putting any force into it. You're kind of just putting your palms on the tire and pushing it left and right.
No, that's
moving the steering wheel back and forth.
Yeah,
well, that's
and
a
some
good
of them
point.
do that too. They'll move the steering wheel back and forth. I'm like, is this play? Like, no, you gotta. There are methods and ways to check it, right? You have to put some strength into it sometimes.
Yeah, well, I'll when I catch them trying to check above their head like that, I'm like, you guys have no power, right? And I'll put my hand in and I'll tell a student, hey, my hand's at shoulder level, give me a push. And I'm like, oh, you're really strong. But I always pick a guy shorter than me. And then I'll put my hand all the way up in the air. I'll say, now push me. And they have no power. I go, lever it. Right? When that tire's above you, you're not using your core strength. And that's actually, I would rather you didn't check my front end. Because the worst thing you can ever do at a shop is check something incorrectly and give it the thumbs up.
Mm-hmm.
I'd rather I have no answer and you say, I can't do it. I'm not knowledgeable enough. I don't know the procedure. I can live with that. The worst thing is you check it inaccurately and give the thumbs up. Because then we're all on the hook for that one, right?
Yeah.
We've kind of like toyed around all the suspension types anyway. So we've talked about MacPherson, but we've also said SLA1 and then there's the SLA2 and what the difference is between them. So Rob, what's an SLA1 and how is it configured?
So 2 arms, short, long arm configuration, which again, the mounting points that they're talking about, frame on one side for both arms, and then your ball joints on the other side, your pivot points for your spindle, your wheel. And SLA1, springs located on the bottom control arm.
Bottom control arm.
Yeah, well, every spring, like, and I always tell my guys too, like, I don't care what your spring is, because that's another thing that'll get them on suspensions.
Torsion bar.
Any type of spring. Yes.
Any type of spring.
Yeah, steel multi-leaf.
Yeah.
So I keep telling them guys, like, don't be spring biased, right?
Yeah.
I don't care what
Don't
your spring
discriminate
is.
on the springs.
Yeah. Well, I say spring. I say spring racism, but then they all get joking away. So it's like spring discrimination. But like, and I say it all the time. I do not care what your spring is. I care where your spring is.
Mounting.
So back to the mounting points.
Yeah. And it's easy for springs, for like the suspension main spring. It's got 3 jobs: support vehicle weight, absorb road shock, keep tire in contact with the ground. Don't worry about the 2 latter ones. Let's go with the first one: support vehicle weight. So every spring, one end is connected to the frame. And then the short answer, the other end, is connected to a moving suspension part, so we can do the other 2 aspects. So one end, is always frame. It's where's the other one go. So yeah, that SLA1, frame to lower control arm. SLA2, all we've done is relocate the spring, frame to upper control arm.
So it's essentially the same components, just move.
But that's the
spring
thing.
above,
The suspension is all the exact same components. They look very similar, except all I've done is move one.
Mhm.
And suddenly all the rules change for load carrying and the application. And that's the thing, getting the students to see, like, they all do look the same. All I did was move one part, one connection point.
But you know what?
And
I'd
the
say
rules
that
change.
between the SLA1 and the SLA2, changing that seating or the spring makes a huge difference in what it looks like. Right? Because now you're going to need a significant amount of space to seat that spring on that upper arm.
So you're being spring racist there.
Why?
when it's a coil,
Sure.
coil is big, takes up a lot of real estate. But torsion bars are sneaky and dirty, right?
That's
Most
true.
of your SLA
Whoa,
ones.
who's being spring racist now?
Yeah. Sorry. Torsion bars, like you think of SLA1 with a torsion bar in the lower, it's on the inboard of the control arm near the frame and runs under the length of the frame.
Yeah.
You make that SLA2 with a torsion bar, it's on the upper control arm near the frame along the length, and then a body is dropped on top of it.
Yeah.
It hides.
And that's one of those things that's relatively rare now. You don't see very many torsion bar springs going to an upper control arm.
Well, the
It's
first
not
time-
uncommon, or it's very uncommon now, and that is one thing we talk about. But what I guess I want to say is, like, you can look at, and one thing that confuses the students, this is what I wanted to say, sorry. One thing that confuses the students is when they look at an SLA Type 1 suspension with a coil over, and the coil is mounted to the body, but through the upper control arm, but not seated on the upper control arm. That's why I like seated, because they're like, oh, well, it's SLA2.
Yeah,
Look, here's
okay.
the upper control arm. Here it is. I'm like, okay, well, it's not
It's
touching it
passing
in any
through
sort of
it,
way,
Yeah.
right? Where is it seated? And then it's like, oh, okay. I find that's
Yeah.
a big thing with the
Yeah,
SLA1
but I think
and 2.
we can say whatever we want. It's like you just need the time of looking at these things and labeling them and getting familiar with them. So that's not something we can easily do in like 2 hours, 4 hours,
Yeah.
6 hours. It is a repetition thing.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So yeah, we got our little tricks and our methods we think help, but it's really, you got to see it. So it's an apprenticeship, right?
Yeah. And then I guess the last thing to really talk about with suspension types would be multi-link and what that
I
might
hate that
be.
term.
Yeah.
I know you do.
We can
I like
argue
that.
about I hate
I
that
like
term.
you call
Or like,
I don't acknowledge multi-link.
What do you call it?
Well, if you look at the list of the typical suspensions we teach, solid I-beam, twin I-beam, SLA1, SLA2, a trail arm suspension, not trail arm the part, trail arm the suspension, our wishbone, our conventional strut, our modified strut, it's one of those always. Right? The multi-link, I hate that name because anytime you have more than 2 linkages, it's a multiple link.
Mhm.
So if you look at what manufacturers call like a multi-link, I think,
It's minimum 3 lateral arms and minimum 1 longitudinal arm.
yeah. But if you look at the actual suspension they call a multi-link, guaranteed you can find the connection points. It's usually an SLA1 or it's a wishbone.
Here's what I'll
It's one of
point
those.
out
Like,
with that, though, is multi-link suspensions are primarily used at the rear end of a vehicle. by the manufacturer's definitions. And at the rear end of the vehicle, we typically don't have an upper ball joint or lower ball joint. We have bushings, right? So loading and unloading do you load a bushing to check it in your suspension typically? Not really, right? Visually inspected, and I am trying to move components if the bushing is excessively worn, but I don't have pivots, right? So my testing is different. So like this is a multi-link. It's interesting. It's fun. Jay loves it, but it doesn't really matter all that much because I don't have pivots here. I'm at the rear of the vehicle.
Yeah, I tear through the multi-link. I say, let's look at it. And you can find it's usually one of two. It's either a wishbone that's not using ball joints, or it's an SLA1 that's not using ball joints. Like it's one of those two, the multi-link, right?
The only
so it's one less suspension to learn if I just get rid of that name because it's too vague.
That's why I like defining it. At least 3 lateral arms, at least 1 longitudinal arm. The benefit is with the multiple arms, you generally have toe adjustment and camber adjustment at the rear as well, versus your set your front toe and go, right? So that's one of the benefits. I like talking about it because it's there and they're going to see it, right? Like, what are all these arms? And I always say, what's multi-link? And they just say multiple links, right? That's why I say,
you're
let's
opening
define
up the door.
Right? But I say that's why we have to define
I would say that for every suspension type. As long as I can count more than 2 pieces, every answer is multi-link. Yeah,
right.
I just get rid of that one.
Students going to be like, you told me on the podcast.
Yeah, update on the next quiz.
No, that's not my class. That's Mr. Gill's class.
And there will be a quiz next
multi-links
week.
do not, if you put multi-link on anything of mine, it's an automatic fail for the course.
If they're putting anything on mine, it's a fail because multiple choice, you don't have the option.
Yeah, but now my guys are going to be adding a 5th one.
You need to add that in as an option on your quizzes now.
Multi-link.
All right. Is there any suspension type we missed?
I don't think so. I learned a lot.
Yeah.
I've never taught SSB 1.
You haven't?
No, I've never taught SSB 1. I've taught SSB 2 last year. I learned a lot. This is a really good one. I didn't get to say a whole lot, but I got to listen.
I have one more definition I'd like cleared up for me too, and that's wishbone.
It's a little dog. He tells stories. They're great.
I thought it was the thing in the turkey.
Yeah, I thought it was the thing we took out of the turkey.
Yeah. You guys don't know Wishbone, the little dog who tells stories?
You don't know turkey?
You guys have kids?
No. Do you know Wishbone? No, we all have kids.
Oh,
no, Harnek, this is
brutal.
Something your parents made up.
No, it was a TV show and books for kids.
Okay.
Little dog that would tell stories.
What suspension did he have?
I don't know. I'm starting to understand.
Multi-link, he's got 4 legs. I don't know. Yeah, there's dog
I'm starting to see
involved.
why your students have difficulty learning suspension types.
Multi-link wishbone.
Yeah.
Picture of a dog.
Something about a
what
dog
suspension
and
is
Sesame Street and a magic school bus. Stay on point, man.
Where are we going today, Miss Frizzle?
Okay, so explain the wishbone versus that SLA one that you just kind of commented on.
I'll tell you right now, there is no wishbone suspension. A wishbone's a component. It's a double pivot control arm, and that's it. That's what I tell them. There is no wishbone suspension. There's a double pivot suspension, or you can, if you call it an SLA1 or an SLA2, that doesn't mean that you have a wishbone or an A-arm. You can use single pivots.
Yeah, I'm just like, I'll show them what I call the wishbone. And I don't do double or single wishbone. And a lot of them, that wishbone shape is gone, right? They won't use it. But I'll always say it's SLA1 with a coil over shock.
Mm-hmm.
So ultimately, like an SLA1, spring goes from frame to lower control arm. It's direct acting. On a wishbone, the spring ultimately goes from frame to lower control arm, but it's not direct acting. It's on that shock. It's coil over shock.
Can you explain the double pivot a little bit more?
So a double pivot is just 2 mounting points. That's what you have with your A-arm or what you might call a wishbone. There's 2 mounting points between the frame and the control arm assembly, and that's all it really is. Versus a single pivot where you just have 1 mounting point between your frame and your control arm.
Okay.
And that's why you need a strut rod, right? That's why you need that additional component. If your job, I always say the job of the control arm is to anchor in the position of the knuckle. It keeps it in the place we want it. Okay. And in order to anchor something, and I want to hold on to something strongest part of the car is the frame. So I bolt up to the frame. If I have 2 points where I'm connected to the frame, I have a more secured component or wheel or knuckle, whatever you want to say.
You know,
right?
instead of using like words like secure and anchor, that's where I throw in the angles thing, right? Mm-hmm. If you have a control arm with 2 location points to the frame, you're preventing the wheel assembly from moving parallel and perpendicular. If you only have a control arm with 1 mounting point to the frame, it only prevents the wheel from moving perpendicular. So you need to add in a secondary strut rod to control that parallel movement.
And then that goes to my next line. I say, well, why would I ever want a single pivot? That's a crap design. Now the arm can, or the wheel can move in this direction. How do I stop that from happening? Right. And you just try to get them to realize.
It's just ergonomics and space, right?
Seemed like you guys were going to go like have an argument there for a second. And
no, we're on the same
we
page.
came back and it was great. Harmonized right at the end.
Remember, we have to share the same workspace.
That was
area,
beautiful.
Right? That's why we have to do this on campus. Yeah. Come 420, we settle it outside in the parking lot like we do every month.
Well, I think that kind of wrapped it up back to your perpendicular angles and everything. So it kind of came full circle there. You guys have been on before, so our 2 questions that we always ask everybody, we can't ask you again.
Perfect. I don't even remember
But I have a
it.
better question. What's your favorite?
Oh, I didn't get the favorite suspension one right. I thought I did.
Movie of all time. What is your favorite movie of all time?
Is it not automotive related?
No,
No.
anything.
No.
Well, I think everyone has to answer Star Wars.
Oh,
Which one?
Really?
There's only one.
Empire?
There's only one.
Empire I saw in
Empire.
theaters. Jedi I saw in theaters. But yeah, out of
A New Hope
the
is
original
your,
3,
is your
I
one
think
and
because
only?
you have to give credit to the first one always, right?
Okay. That I wouldn't expect that from you.
That's an answer everybody has to give. So if your question like, what's your favorite
I mean, I
movie?
don't think
not
Rob's-
counting
not
the one
everybody has to
everybody
give
loves.
that. I don't
you
think
kinda
Rob's
do.
going to say Star Wars.
He hasn't
No,
seen
I
it
was
yet.
never going to
Rob's
say
never
Star
even
Wars.
seen Star Wars.
And if I
Scary.
was going to say Star Wars, it would have been episode 3, the one where he becomes Darth Vader. It was the
Empire.
best one.
Oh, you're
See,
talking about
those
Revenge of the Sith.
aren't even
yeah, Revenge of
Yeah.
the Sith.
Yeah.
Okay, you
That
had
was-
1977. You had 81, and you had like 85.
There was a
There's no other-
1977.
Not in my lifetime.
So then, Rob, what's your favorite movie? I know it's not Star Wars.
No, it's definitely not Star Wars. What's the one with that big hairy guy, the Han Solo,
Yeah.
the light swords? That's a great one.
Yeah, that big bear. Yeah, the large bear.
That's Star Wars.
You know what? I recently just watched it again, and I'm gonna say that currently, right now, it's up there. Talladega Nights.
Sweet.
Yeah,
Ballad of Ricky
Step
Bobby.
Brothers, Talladega.
Bobby.
Yeah, any one of those like Will Ferrell.
Yeah, there's so
type
many good movies.
There's
Yeah.
it's hard to pick. So I just recently watched that at home, preparing for this podcast actually. And
If you ain't first.
yeah, if you ain't first, you're last. That's trademark.
Don't let the fear get you. Yeah.
So yeah,
Cool.
I'm gonna go with that.
I like that. All right. Well, I think that wraps it up. Thank you all for listening. If you have a topic, question, or thought that you would like us to chat about, please contact or email icampbell@centennialcollege.ca. And if you like the episode or just like us, please follow along, subscribe, or leave a review. That would be awesome. Well, until next time.
Thanks for joining us, folks.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
All right. See you then. Bye now.
Bye, Nick.